Chapter 22 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 22. The remainder of that day and the whole of the next were a busy time for the Nubbles family, to whom everything connected with Kit's outfit and departure was matter of as great moment as if he had been about to penetrate into the interior of Africa, or to take a cruise round the world. It would be difficult to suppose that there ever was a box which was opened and shut so many times within 24 hours as that which contained his wardrobe and necessaries, and certainly there never was one which to two small eyes presented such a mine of clothing as this mighty chest with its 3 shirts and proportionate allowance of stockings and pocket-handkerchiefs, disclosed to the astonished vision of little Jacob. At last it was conveyed to the carrier's, at whose house at Finchley Kit was to find it next day, and the box being gone, there remained but 2 questions for consideration. Firstly, whether the carrier would lose, or dishonestly feign to lose, the box upon the road. Secondly, whether Kit's mother perfectly understood how to take care of herself in the absence of her son.
'I don't think there's hardly a chance of his really losing it, but carriers are under great temptation to pretend they lose things, no doubt,' said Mrs Nubbles apprehensively in reference to the first point. 'No doubt about it,' returned Kit with a serious look. 'Upon my word, mother, I don't think it was right to trust it to itself. Somebody ought to have gone with it, I'm afraid.' 'We can't help it now,' said his mother, 'but it was foolish and wrong. People oughtn't to be tempted.' Kit inwardly resolved that he would never tempt a carrier any more, save with an empty box, and having formed this Christian determination, he turned his thoughts to the second question. 'You know, you must keep up your spirits, mother, and not be lonesome because I'm not at home. I shall very often be able to look in when I come into town, I dare say, and I shall send you a letter sometimes, and when the quarter comes round I can get a holiday, of course, and then see if we don't take little Jacob to the play and let him know what oysters means.' 'I hope plays mayn't be sinful, Kit, but I'm almost afraid,' said Mrs Nubbles. 'I know who's been putting that into your head,' rejoined her son disconsolately. 'That's little Bethel again. Now I say, mother, pray don't take to going there regularly, for if I was to see your good-humoured face that has always made home cheerful turn into a grievous one, and the baby trained to look grievous too, and to call itself a young sinner, bless its heart, and a child of the devil, which is calling its dead father names, if I was to see this, and see little Jacob looking grievous likewise, I should so take it to heart that I'm sure I should go enlist for a soldier, and run my head on purpose against the first cannon ball I saw coming my way.' 'Oh, Kit, don't talk like that.' 'I would indeed, mother, and unless you want to make me feel very wretched and uncomfortable, you'll keep that bow on your bonnet, which you'd more than half a mind to pull off last week. Can you suppose there any harm in looking as cheerful and being as cheerful as our poor circumstances will permit? Do I see anything in the way I'm made which calls upon me to be a snivelling, solemn, whispering chap, sneaking about as if I couldn't help it and expressing myself in a most unpleasant snuffle? On the contrary, don't I see every reason why I shouldn't? Just hear this! And as natural as walking, and as good for the health, and as natural as a sheep's bleating, or a pig's grunting, or a horse's neighing, or a bird singing. Isn't it, mother?'
There was something contagious in Kit's laugh, for his mother, who had looked grave before, first subsided into a smile, and then fell to joining in it heartily, which occasioned Kit to say that he knew it was natural, and to laugh the more. Kit and his mother laughing together in a pretty loud key woke the baby, who, finding that there was something very jovial and agreeable in progress, was no sooner in its mother's arms than it began to kick and laugh most vigorously. This new illustration of his argument so tickled Kit that he fell backward in his chair in a state of exhaustion, pointing at the baby and shaking his sides till he rocked again. After recovering twice or thrice, and as often relapsing, he wiped his eyes and said grace, and a very cheerful meal their scanty supper was. With more kisses and hugs and tears than many young gentlemen who start upon their travels and leave well-stocked homes behind them would deem within the bounds of probability, if matter so low could be herein set down, Kit left the house at an early hour next morning and set out to walk to Finchley, feeling a sufficient pride in his appearance to have warranted his excommunication from Little Bethel from that time forth, if he had ever been one of that mournful congregation. Lest anybody should feel a curiosity to know how Kit was clad, it may be briefly remarked that he wore no livery, but was dressed in a coat of pepper and salt, with waistcoat of canary colour, and nether garments of iron grey. Besides these glories, he shone in the lustre of a new pair of boots, and an extremely stiff and shiny hat, which on being struck anywhere with the knuckles sounded like a drum. And in this attire, rather wondering that he attracted so little attention, and attributing the circumstance to the insensibility of those who got up early, he made his way towards Abel Cottage. Without encountering any more remarkable adventure on the road, and meeting a lad in a brimless hat, the exact counterpart of his old one, on whom he bestowed half the sixpence he possessed, Kit arrived in course of time at the carrier's house, where, to the lasting honour of human nature, he found the box in safety. Receiving from the wife of this immaculate man a direction to Mr Garland's, he took the box upon his shoulder and repaired thither directly. To be sure, it was a beautiful little cottage, with a thatched roof, and little spires at the gable ends, and pieces of stained glass in some of the windows almost as large as pocket-books. On one side of the house was a little stable, just the size for the pony, with a little room over it, just the size for Kit. White curtains were fluttering, and birds in cages that looked as bright as if they were made of gold were singing at the windows. Plants were arranged on either side of the path, and clustered about the door, and the garden was bright with flowers in full bloom, which shed a sweet odour all round and had a charming and elegant appearance. Everything within the house and without seemed to be the perfection of neatness and order. In the garden there was not a weed to be seen, and to judge from some dapper gardening tools, a basket and a pair of gloves which were lying in one of the walks, old Mr Garland had been at work in it that very morning. Kit looked about him and admired, and looked again, and this a great many times before he could make up his mind to turn his head another way and ring the bell. There was abundance of time to look about him again, though, when he had rung it, for nobody came, so after ringing it twice or thrice, he sat down upon his box and waited. He rang the bell a great many times, and yet nobody came. But at last, as he was sitting upon the box thinking about giants' castles, and princesses tied up to pegs by the hair of their heads, and dragons bursting out from behind gates, and other incidents of the like nature, common in story-books to youths of low degree on their first visit to strange houses, the door was gently opened, and a little servant girl, very tidy, modest, and demure, but very pretty too, appeared. 'I suppose you're Christopher, sir?' said the servant girl. Kit got off the box and said yes, he was. 'I'm afraid you've rung a good many times, perhaps,' she rejoined, 'but we couldn't hear you because we've been catching the pony.' Kit rather wondered what this meant, but as he couldn't stop there, asking questions, he shouldered the box again and followed the girl into the hall, where through a back door he descried Mr Garland leading Whisker in triumph up the garden, after that self-willed pony had, as he afterwards learnt, dodged the family round a small paddock in the rear for 1 hour and 3/4. The old gentleman received him very kindly, and so did the old lady, whose previous good opinion of him was greatly enhanced by his wiping his boots on the mat until the soles of his feet burnt again. He was then taken into the parlour to be inspected in his new clothes, and when he had been surveyed several times, and had afforded by his appearance unlimited satisfaction, he was taken into the stable, where the pony received him with uncommon complaisance, and thence into the little chamber he had already observed, which was very clean and comfortable, and thence into the garden, in which the old gentleman told him he would be taught to employ himself, and where he told him, besides, what great things he meant to do to make him comfortable and happy, if he found he deserved it. All these kindnesses Kit acknowledged with various expressions of gratitude, and so many touches of the new hat that the brim suffered considerably. When the old gentleman had said all he had to say in the way of promises and advice, and Kit had said all he had to say in the way of assurance and thankfulness, he was handed over again to the old lady, who, summoning the little servant girl, whose name was Barbara, instructed her to take him downstairs and give him something to eat and drink after his walk. Downstairs, therefore, Kit went, and at the bottom of the stairs there was such a kitchen as was never before seen or heard of out of a toy-shop window, with everything in it as bright and glowing, and as precisely ordered, too, as Barbara herself. And in this kitchen Kit sat himself down at a table as white as a tablecloth, to eat cold meat and drink small ale, and use his knife and fork the more awkwardly because there was an unknown Barbara looking on and observing him. It did not appear, however, that there was anything remarkably tremendous about this strange Barbara, who, having lived a very quiet life, blushed very much, and was quite as embarrassed and uncertain what she ought to say or do as Kit could possibly be. When he had sat for some little time, attentive to the ticking of the sober clock, he ventured to glance curiously at the dresser, and there, among the plates and dishes, were Barbara's little work-box with a sliding lid to shut in the balls of cotton, and Barbara's prayer-book, and Barbara's hymn-book, and Barbara's Bible. Barbara's little looking-glass hung in a good light near the window, and Barbara's bonnet was on a nail behind the door. From all these mute signs and tokens of her presence, he naturally glanced at Barbara herself, who sat as mute as they, shelling peas into a dish. And just when Kit was looking at her eyelashes and wondering, quite in the simplicity of his heart, what colour her eyes might be, it perversely happened that Barbara raised her head a little to look at him, when both pair of eyes were hastily withdrawn, and Kit leant over his plate, and Barbara over her pea-shells, each in extreme confusion at having been detected by the other. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 23. Mr. Richard Swiveler, wending homeward from the wilderness, for such was the appropriate name of Quilp's choice retreat, after a sinuous and corkscrew fashion, with many checks and stumbles, after stopping suddenly and staring about him, then as suddenly running forward for a few paces, and as suddenly halting again and shaking his head, doing everything with a jerk, and nothing by premeditation. Mr. Richard Swiveler, wending his way homeward after this fashion, which is considered by evil-minded men to be symbolical of intoxication, and is not held by such persons to denote that state of deep wisdom and reflection in which the actor knows himself to be, began to think that possibly he had misplaced his confidence, and that the dwarf might not be precisely the sort of person to whom to entrust a secret of such delicacy and importance. And being led and tempted on by this remorseful thought into a condition which the evil-minded class before referred to would term the maudlin state or stage of drunkenness, it occurred to Mr Swiveller to cast his hat upon the ground and moan, crying aloud that he was an unhappy orphan, and that if he had not been an unhappy orphan, things had never come to this. "Left an infant by my parents at an early age," said Mr Swiveller, bewailing his hard lot, "cast upon the world in my tenderest period, and thrown upon the mercies of a deluding dwarf. Who can wonder at my weakness? Here's a miserable orphan for you here," said Mr Swiveller, raising his voice to a high pitch and looking sleepily around. "Here's a miserable orphan."
"Then," said somebody hard by, "let me be a father to you."
Mr Swiveller swayed himself to and fro to preserve his balance, and, looking into a kind of haze which seemed to surround him, at last perceived two eyes dimly twinkling through the mist, which he observed after a short time were in the neighbourhood of a nose and mouth. Casting his eyes down towards that quarter in which, with reference to a man's face, his legs are usually to be found, he observed that the face had a body attached, and when he looked more intently, he was satisfied that the person was Mr Quilp, who indeed had been in his company all the time, but whom he had some vague idea of having left a mile or two behind.
'You have deceived an orphan, sir,' said Mr Swiveller solemnly. 'I'm a second father to you,' replied Quilp. 'You my father, sir?' retorted Dick. 'Being all right myself, sir, I request to be left alone. Instantly, sir.' 'What a funny fellow you are!' cried Quilp. 'Go, sir,' returned Dick, leaning against a post and waving his hand. 'Go, deceiver! Go! Some day, sir, perhaps you'll waken from pleasure's dream to know the grief of orphans forsaken. Will you go, sir?'
The dwarf, taking no heed of this adjuration, Mr Swiveller advanced with the view of inflicting upon him condign chastisement, but forgetting his purpose, or changing his mind before he came close to him, he seized his hand and vowed eternal friendship, declaring with an agreeable frankness that from that time forth they were brothers in everything but personal appearance. Then he told his secret all over again, with the addition of being pathetic on the subject of Miss Wackles, who, he gave Mr Quilp to understand, was the occasion of any slight incoherency he might observe in his speech at that moment, which was attributable solely to the strength of his affection, and not to rosy wine or other fermented liquor. And then they went on, arm in arm, very lovingly together.
'I'm as sharp,' said Quilp to him at parting, 'as sharp as a ferret, and as cunning as a weasel. You bring Trent to me, assure him that I'm his friend, though I fear he a little distrusts me. I don't know why, I've not deserved it. And you've both of you made your fortunes in perspective.' 'That's the worst of it,' returned Dick. 'These fortunes in perspective look such a long way off.' 'But they look smaller than they really are on that account,' said Quilp, pressing his arm. 'You'll have no conception of the value of your prize until you draw close to it. Mark that.' 'D'ye think not?' said Dick. 'Aye, I do. And I am certain of what I say that's better,' returned the dwarf. 'You bring Trent to me. Tell him I'm his friend and yours. Why shouldn't I be?' 'There's no reason why you shouldn't, certainly,' replied Dick. 'And perhaps there are a great many why you should. At least, there would be nothing strange in your wanting to be my friend if you were a choice spirit. But then, you know, you're not a choice spirit.' 'I not a choice spirit?' cried Quilp. 'Devil a bit, sir,' returned Dick. 'A man of your appearance couldn't be. If you're any spirit at all, sir, you're an evil spirit. Choice spirits,' added Dick, smiting himself on the breast, 'are quite a different looking sort of people. You may take your oath of that, sir.' Quilp glanced at his free-spoken friend with a mingled expression of cunning and dislike, and wringing his hand almost at the same moment, declared that he was an uncommon character and had his warmest esteem. With that they parted, Mr Swiveller to make the best of his way home and sleep himself sober, and Quilp to cogitate upon the discovery he had made, and exult in the prospect of the rich field of enjoyment and reprisal it opened to him. It was not without great reluctance and misgiving that Mr Swiveller, next morning, his head racked by the fumes of the renowned Skedam, repaired to the lodging of his friend Trent, which was in the roof of an old house in an old ghostly inn,
and recounted by very slow degrees what had yesterday taken place between him and Quilp. Nor was it without great surprise and much speculation on Quilp's probable motives, nor without many bitter comments on Dick Swiveller's folly, that his friend received the tale. 'I don't defend myself, Fred,' said the penitent Richard, 'but the fellow had such a queer way with him, and he's such an artful dog, that first of all he set me upon thinking whether there was any harm in telling him, and while I was thinking, screwed it out of me. If you had seen him drink and smoke as I did, you couldn't have kept anything from him. He's a salamander, you know. That's what he is.' Without inquiring whether salamanders were of necessity good confidential agents, or whether a fireproof man was as a matter of course trustworthy, Frederick Trent threw himself into a chair, and burying his head in his hands, endeavoured to fathom the motives which had led Quilp to insinuate himself into Richard Swiveller's confidence. For that the disclosure was of his seeking, and had not been spontaneously revealed by Dick, was sufficiently plain from Quilp's seeking his company and enticing him away. The dwarf had twice encountered him when he was endeavouring to obtain intelligence of the fugitives. This, perhaps, as he had not shown any previous anxiety about them, was enough to awaken suspicion in the breast of a creature so jealous and distrustful by nature, setting aside any additional impulse to curiosity that he might have derived from Dick's incautious manner. But knowing the scheme they had planned, why should he offer to assist it? This was a question more difficult of solution. But as knaves generally overreach themselves by imputing their own designs to others, the idea immediately presented itself that some circumstances of irritation between Quilp and the old man, arising out of their secret transactions and not unconnected perhaps with his sudden disappearance, now rendered the former desirous of revenging himself upon him by seeking to entrap the sole object of his love and anxiety into a connection of which he knew he had a dread and hatred. As Frederick Trent himself, utterly regardless of his sister, had this object at heart, only second to the hope of gain, it seemed to him the more likely to be Quilp's main principle of action. Once investing the dwarf with a design of his own in abetting them, which the attainment of their purpose would serve, it was easy to believe him sincere and hearty in the cause, and as there could be no doubt of his proving a powerful and useful auxiliary, Trent determined to accept his invitation and go to his house that night, and if what he said and did confirmed him in the impression he had formed, to let him share the labour of their plan, but not the profit. Having revolved these things in his mind, and arrived at this conclusion, he communicated to Mr Swiveller as much of his meditations as he thought proper. Dick would have been perfectly satisfied with less, and giving him the day to recover himself from his late salamandering, accompanied him at evening to Mr Quilp's house. Mighty glad Mr Quilp was to see them, or mightily glad he seemed to be, and fearfully polite Mr Quilp was to Mrs Quilp and Mrs Jiniwin, and very sharp was the look he cast on his wife to observe how she was affected by the recognition of young Trent. Mrs Quilp was as innocent as her own mother of any emotion, painful or pleasant, which the sight of him awakened. But as her husband's glance made her timid and confused and uncertain what to do or what was required of her, Mr Quilp did not fail to assign her embarrassment to the cause he had in his mind, and while he chuckled at his penetration, was secretly exasperated by his jealousy. Nothing of this appeared, however. On the contrary, Mr Quilp was all blandness and suavity, and presided over the case-bottle of rum with extraordinary open-heartedness.
'Why, let me see,' said Quilp. 'It must be a matter of nearly 2 years since we were first acquainted.'
'Nearer 3, I think,' said Trent.
'Nearer 3!' cried Quilp. 'How fast time flies! Does it seem as long as that to you, Mrs Quilp?' 'Yes, I think it seems full 3 years, Quilp,' was the unfortunate reply. 'Oh, indeed, ma'am,' thought Quilp. 'You have been pining, have you? Very good, ma'am.' 'It seems to me but yesterday that you went out to Demerara in the Mary Ann,' said Quilp. 'But yesterday, I declare. Well, I like a little wildness. I was wild myself once.' Mr Quilp accompanied this admission with such an awful wink, indicative of old rovings and backslidings,
that Mrs Jiniwin was indignant, and could not forbear from remarking under her breath that he might at least put off his confessions until his wife was absent, for which act of boldness and insubordination Mr Quilp first stared her out of countenance, and then drank her health ceremoniously.
'I thought you'd come back directly, Fred. I always thought that,' said Quilp, setting down his glass. 'And when the Mary Ann returned with you on board, instead of a letter to say what a contrite heart you had, and how happy you were in the situation that had been provided for you, I was amused, exceedingly amused.'
The young man smiled, but not as though the theme was the most agreeable one that could have been selected for his entertainment, and for that reason Quilp pursued it.
'I always will say,' he resumed, 'that when a rich relation having two young people, sisters or brothers, or brother and sister, dependent on him, attaches himself exclusively to one, and casts off the other, he does wrong.' The young man made a movement of impatience, but Quilp went on as calmly as if he were discussing some abstract question in which nobody present had the slightest personal interest. 'It's very true,' said Quilp, 'that your grandfather urged repeated forgiveness, ingratitude, riot, and extravagance, and all that. But as I told him, these are common faults. But he's a scoundrel, said he. Granting that, said I, for the sake of argument of course, a great many young noblemen and gentlemen are scoundrels too. But he wouldn't be convinced.
'I wonder at that, Mr Quilp,' said the young man, sarcastically.
'Well, so did I at the time,' returned Quilp, 'but he was always obstinate. He was in a manner a friend of mine, but he was always obstinate and wrong-headed. Little Nell is a nice girl, a charming girl, but you're her brother, Frederick. You're her brother, after all. As you told him the last time you met, he can't alter that.'
'He would if he could, confound him for that and all other kindnesses,' said the young man impatiently. 'But nothing can come of this subject now, and let us have done with it in the devil's name.'
'Agreed,' returned Quilp. 'Agreed on my part readily. Why have I alluded to it? Just to show you, Frederick, that I have always stood your friend. You little knew who was your friend and who your foe, now did you? You thought I was against you, and so there has been a coolness between us. But it was all on your side, entirely on your side. Let's shake hands again, Fred.'
With his head sunk down between his shoulders, and a hideous grin overspreading his face, the dwarf stood up and stretched his short arm across the table. After a moment's hesitation, the young man stretched out his to meet it. Quilp clutched his fingers in a grip that for the moment stopped the current of the blood within them, and pressing his other hand upon his lip and frowning towards the unsuspicious Richard, released them and sat down. This action was not lost upon Trent, who, knowing that Richard Swiveller was a mere tool in his hands, and knew no more of his designs than he thought proper to communicate, saw that the dwarf perfectly understood their relative position, and fully entered into the character of his friend. It is something to be appreciated, even in knavery. This silent homage to his superior abilities, no less than a sense of the power with which the dwarf's quick perception had already invested him, inclined the young man towards that ugly worthy, and determined him to profit by his aid. It being now Mr Quilp's cue to change the subject with all convenient expedition, lest Richard Swiveller, in his heedlessness, should reveal anything which it was inexpedient for the women to know, he proposed a game at four-handed cribbage, and partners being cut for, Mrs Quilp fell to Frederick Trent, and Dick himself to Quilp. Mrs Jiniwin, being very fond of cards, was carefully excluded by her son-in-law from any participation in the game, and had assigned her to the duty of occasionally replenishing the glasses from the case-bottle. Mr Quilp from that moment keeping one eye constantly upon her, lest she should by any means procure a taste of the same, and thereby tantalizing the wretched old lady, who was as much attached to the case-bottle as the cards, in a double degree and most ingenious manner. But it was not to Mrs Jiniwin alone that Mr Quilp's attention was restricted, as several other matters required his constant vigilance. Among his various eccentric habits he had a humorous one of always cheating at cards, which rendered necessary on his part not only a close observance of the game and a sleight of hand in counting and scoring, but also involved the constant correction, by looks and frowns and kicks under the table, of Richard Swiveler, who, being bewildered by the rapidity with which his cards were told, and the rate at which the pegs travelled down the board, could not be prevented from sometimes expressing his surprise and incredulity. Mrs Quilp, too, was the partner of young Trent, and for every look that passed between them, and every word they spoke, and every card they played, the dwarf had eyes and ears, not occupied alone with what was passing above the table, but with signals that might be exchanging beneath it, which he laid all kinds of traps to detect, besides often treading on his wife's toes to see whether she cried out or remained silent under the infliction, in which latter case it would have been quite clear that Trent had been treading on her toes before. Yet in the most of all these distractions, the one eye was upon the old lady always, and if she so much as stealthily advanced a teaspoon towards a neighbouring glass, which she often did, for the purpose of abstracting but one sup of its sweet contents, Quilp's hand would overset it in the very moment of her triumph, and Quilp's mocking voice implore her to regard her precious health. And in any one of these his many cares, from first to last, Quilp never flagged nor faltered. At length, when they had played a great many rubbers, and drawn pretty freely upon the case-bottle, Mr Quilp warned his lady to retire to rest, and that submissive wife complying, and being followed by her indignant mother, Mr Swiveller fell asleep. The dwarf, beckoning his remaining companion to the other end of the room, held a short conference with him in whispers.
"It's as well not to say more than one can help before our worthy friend," said Quilp, making a grimace towards the slumbering Dick. "Is it a bargain between us, Fred? Shall he marry little rosy Nell by and by?"
"You have some end of your own to answer, of course," returned the other.
"Of course I have, dear Fred," said Quilp, grinning to think how little he suspected what the real end was. "It's retaliation, perhaps whim. I have influence, Fred, to help or oppose. Which way shall I use it? There are a pair of scales, and it goes into one."
"Throw it into mine, then," said Trent.
"It's done, Fred," rejoined Quilp, stretching out his clenched hand and opening it as if he had let some weight fall out. "It's in the scale from this time, and turns it, Fred. Mind that."
"Where have they gone?" asked Trent. Quilp shook his head, and said that point remained to be discovered, which it might be easily. When it was, they would begin their preliminary advances. He would visit the old man, or even Richard Swiveller might visit him, and by affecting a deep concern in his behalf, and imploring him to settle in some worthy home, lead to the child's remembering him with gratitude and favour. Once impressed to this extent, it would be easy, he said, to win her in a year or two, for she supposed the old man to be poor, as it was a part of his jealous policy, in common with many other misers, to feign to be so to those about him. "He has feigned it often enough to me of late," said Trent.
"Oh, and to me too," replied the dwarf, "which is more extraordinary, as I know how rich he really is."
"I suppose you should," said Trent.
"I think I should indeed,"
rejoined the dwarf. And in that, at least, he spoke the truth. After a few more whispered words, they returned to the table, and the young man, rousing Richard Swiveller, informed him that he was waiting to depart. This was welcome news to Dick, who started up directly. After a few words of confidence in the result of their project had been exchanged, they bade the grinning Quilp good night. Quilp crept to the window as they passed in the street below, and listened. Trent was pronouncing an encomium upon his wife, and they were both wondering by what enchantment she had been brought to marry such a misshapen wretch as he. The dwarf, after watching their retreating shadows with a wider grin than his face had yet displayed, stole softly in the dark to bed. In this hatching of their scheme, neither Trent nor Quilp had had one thought about the happiness or misery of poor innocent Nell. It would have been strange if the careless profligate, who was the butt of both, had been harassed by any such consideration, for his high opinion of his own merits and deserts rendered the project rather a laudable one than otherwise. And if he had been visited by so unwonted a guest as reflection, he would, being a brute only in the gratification of his appetites, have soothed his conscience with the plea that he did not mean to beat or kill his wife, and would therefore, after all said and done, be a very tolerable average husband. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 24. It was not until they were quite exhausted, and could no longer maintain the pace at which they had fled from the race-ground, that the old man and the child ventured to stop, and sit down to rest upon the borders of a little wood. Here, though the course was hidden from their view, they could yet faintly distinguish the noise of distant shouts, the hum of voices, and the beating of drums. Climbing the eminence which lay between them and the spot they had left, the child could even discern the fluttering flags and white tops of booths, but no person was approaching towards them, and their resting-place was solitary and still. Some time elapsed before she could reassure her trembling companion or restore him to a state of moderate tranquillity. His disordered imagination represented to him a crowd of persons stealing towards them beneath the cover of the bushes, lurking in every ditch, and peeping from the boughs of every rustling tree. He was haunted by apprehensions of being led captive to some gloomy place, where he would be chained and scourged, and worse than all, where Nell could never come to see him, save through iron bars and gratings in the wall. His terrors affected the child. Separation from her grandfather was the greatest evil she could dread, and feeling for the time as though, go where they were to be hunted down and could never be safe but in hiding, her heart failed her, and her courage drooped. In one so young, and so unused to the scenes in which she had lately moved, this sinking of the spirit was not surprising. But nature often enshrines gallant and noble hearts in weak bosoms, oftenest, God bless her, in female breasts, and when the child, casting her tearful eyes upon the old man, remembered how weak he was and how destitute and helpless he would be if she failed him, her heart swelled within her and animated her with new strength and fortitude. "We are quite safe now, and have nothing to fear indeed, dear grandfather," she said. "Nothing to fear," returned the old man. "Nothing to fear if they took me from thee? Nothing to fear if they parted us? Nobody is true to me, no, not one, not even Nell." "Oh, do not say that," replied the child, "for if ever anybody was true at heart and earnest, I am. I am sure you know I am." "Then how," said the old man, looking fearfully round, "how can you bear to think that we are safe, when they are searching for me everywhere, and may come here and steal upon us even while we're talking?" "Because I'm sure we have not been followed," said the child. "Judge for yourself, dear grandfather. Look round, and see how quiet and still it is. We are alone together, and may ramble where we like. Not safe! Could I feel easy, did I feel at ease, when any danger threatened you?" "True, too," he answered, pressing her hand, but still looking anxiously about. "What noise was that?" "A bird," said the child, "flying into the wood, and leading the way for us to follow. You remember that we said we would walk in woods and fields, and by the side of rivers, and how happy we would be. You remember that? But here,
while the sun shines above our heads and everything is bright and happy, we are sitting sadly down and losing time. See what a pleasant path! And there's the bird, the same bird. Now he flies to another tree and stays to sing. Come!"
When they rose up from the ground, and took the shady track which led them through the wood, she bounded on before, printing her tiny footsteps in the moss, which rose elastic from so light a pressure, and gave it back as mirrors throw off breath. And thus she lured the old man on, with many a backward look and merry beck, now pointing stealthily to some lone bird as it perched and twittered on a branch that strayed across their path, now stopping to listen to the songs that broke the happy silence, or watch the sun as it trembled through the leaves, and stealing in among the ivied trunks of stout old trees, opened long paths of light. As they passed onward, parting the boughs that clustered in their way, the serenity which the child had first assumed stole into her breast in earnest. The old man cast no longer fearful looks behind, but felt at ease and cheerful, for the further they passed into the deep green shade, the more they felt that the tranquil mind of God was there, and shed its peace on them. At length the path, becoming clearer and less intricate, brought them to the end of the wood and into a public road. Taking their way along it for a short distance, they came to a lane, so shaded by the trees on either hand that they met together overhead, and arched the narrow way. A broken finger-post announced that this led to a village 3 miles off, and thither they resolved to bend their steps. The miles appeared so long that they sometimes thought they must have missed their road, but at last, to their great joy, it led downwards in a steep descent, with overhanging banks over which the footpaths led, and the clustered houses of the village peeped from the woody hollow below. It was a very small place. The men and boys were playing at cricket on the green, and as the other folks were looking on, they wandered up and down, uncertain where to seek a humble lodging. There was but one old man in the little garden before his cottage, and him they were timid of approaching, for he was the schoolmaster, and had school written up over his window in black letters on a white board. He was a pale, simple-looking man, of a spare and meagre habit, and sat among his flowers and beehives, smoking his pipe in the little porch before his door.
"Speak to him, dear,"
the old man whispered.
"I am almost afraid to disturb him,"
said the child timidly.
"He does not seem to see us. Perhaps if we wait a little, he may look this way."
They waited, but the schoolmaster cast no look towards them, and still sat, thoughtful and silent, in the little porch. He had a kind face. In his plain old suit of black, he looked pale and meagre. They fancied, too, a lonely air about him and his house, but perhaps that was because the other people formed a merry company upon the green, and he seemed the only solitary man in all the place. They were very tired, and the child would have been bold enough to address even a schoolmaster, but for something in his manner which seemed to denote that he was uneasy or distressed. As they stood hesitating at a little distance, they saw that he sat for a few minutes at a time like one in a brown study, then laid aside his pipe and took a few turns in his garden, then approached the gate and looked towards the green, then took up his pipe again with a sigh, and sat down thoughtfully as before. As nobody else appeared, and it would soon be dark, Nell at length took courage, and when he had resumed his pipe and seat, ventured to draw near, leading her grandfather by the hand. The slight noise they made in raising the latch of the wicket gate caught his attention. He looked at them kindly, but seemed disappointed too, and slightly shook his head. Nell dropped a curtsy, and told him they were poor travellers who sought a shelter for the night, which they would gladly pay for, so far as their means allowed. The schoolmaster looked earnestly at her as she spoke, laid aside his pipe, and rose up directly.
"If you could direct us anywhere, sir," said the child, "we should take it very kindly."
"You have been walking a long way," said the schoolmaster.
"A long way, sir,"
the child replied.
"You're a young traveller, my child,"
he said, laying his hand gently on her head.
"Your grandchild, friend?" 'Ay, sir,' cried the old man, 'and the stay and comfort of my life.' 'Come in,' said the schoolmaster. Without further preface, he conducted them into his little schoolroom, which was parlour and kitchen likewise, and told them that they were welcome to remain under his roof till morning. Before they had done thanking him, he spread a coarse white cloth upon the table, with knives and platters, and bringing out some bread and cold meat and a jug of beer, besought them to eat and drink. The child looked round the room as she took her seat. There were a couple of forms, notched and cut and inked all over, a small deal desk perched on 4 legs, at which no doubt the master sat, a few dog's-eared books upon a high shelf, and beside them a motley collection of peg-tops, balls, kites, fishing lines, marbles, half-eaten apples, and other confiscated property of idle urchins. Displayed on hooks upon the wall in all their terrors were the cane and ruler, and near them, on a small shelf of its own, the dunce's cap, made of old newspapers and decorated with glaring wafers of the largest size. But the great ornaments of the walls were certain moral sentences fairly copied in good round text, and well-worked sums in simple addition and multiplication, evidently achieved by the same hand, which were plentifully pasted all round the room, for the double purpose, as it seemed, of bearing testimony to the excellence of the school, and kindling a worthy emulation in the bosoms of the scholars. 'Yes,' said the old schoolmaster, observing that her attention was caught by these latter specimens, 'that's beautiful writing, my dear.'
'Very, sir,' replied the child modestly. 'Is it yours?'
'Mine?' he returned, taking out his spectacles and putting them on, to have a better view of the triumphs so dear to his heart. 'I couldn't write like that nowadays. No, they're all done by one hand. A little hand it is, not so old as yours, but a very clever one.' As the schoolmaster said this, he saw that a small blot of ink had been thrown on one of the copies, so he took a penknife from his pocket, and going up to the wall, carefully scraped it out. When he had finished, he walked slowly backward from the writing, admiring it as one might contemplate a beautiful picture, but with something of sadness in his voice and manner, which quite touched the child, though she was unacquainted with its cause. 'A little hand indeed,' said the poor schoolmaster, 'far beyond all his companions, in his learning and his sports too. How did he ever come to be so fond of me? That I should love him is no wonder, but that he should love me!' And there the schoolmaster stopped, and took off his spectacles to wipe them, as though they had grown dim.
'I hope there is nothing the matter, sir?'
said Nell anxiously. 'Not much, my dear,' returned the schoolmaster. 'I hoped to have seen him on the green to-night. He was always foremost among them. But he'll be there to-morrow.'
'Has he been ill?'
asked the child, with a child's quick sympathy. 'Not very. They said he was wandering in his head yesterday, dear boy, and so they said the day before. But that's a part of that kind of disorder. It's not a bad sign. No, not at all a bad sign.' The child was silent. He walked to the door, and looked wistfully out. The shadows of night were gathering, and all was still. 'If he could lean upon anybody's arm, he would come to me, I know,' he said, returning into the room. 'He always came into the garden to say good night. But perhaps his illness has only just taken a favourable turn, and it's too late for him to come out, for it's very damp and there's a heavy dew. It's much better he shouldn't come to-night.' The schoolmaster lighted a candle, fastened the window shutter, and closed the door. But after he had done this, and sat silent a little time, he took down his hat and said he would go and satisfy himself, if Nell would sit up till he returned. The child readily complied, and he went out. She sat there half an hour or more, feeling the place very strange and lonely, for she had prevailed upon the old man to go to bed, and there was nothing to be heard but the ticking of an old clock and the whistling of the wind among the trees. When he returned, he took his seat in the chimney corner, but remained silent for a long time.
At length he turned to her, and speaking very gently, hoped she would say a prayer that night for a sick child. 'My favourite scholar,' said the poor schoolmaster, smoking a pipe he had forgotten to light, and looking mournfully round upon the walls. 'It is a little hand to have done all that, and waste away with sickness. It is a very, very little hand.' End of chapter 24. Of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 25. After a sound night's rest in a chamber in the thatched roof, in which it seemed the sexton had for some years been a lodger, but which he had lately deserted for a wife and a cottage of his own, the child rose early in the morning and descended to the room where she had supped last night. As the schoolmaster had already left his bed and gone out, she bestirred herself to make it neat and comfortable, and had just finished its arrangement when the kind host returned. He thanked her many times, and said that the old dame who usually did such offices for him had gone to nurse the little scholar whom he had told her of. The child asked how he was, and hoped he was better. 'No,' rejoined the schoolmaster, shaking his head sorrowfully, 'no better. They even say he is worse.'
'I am very sorry for that, sir,' said the child. The poor schoolmaster appeared to be gratified by her earnest manner, but yet rendered more uneasy by it, for he added hastily that anxious people often magnified an evil and thought it greater than it was. 'For my part,' he said in his quiet, patient way, 'I hope it's not so. I don't think he can be worse.' The child asked his leave to prepare breakfast, and her grandfather coming downstairs, they all three partook of it together. While the meal was in progress, their host remarked that the old man seemed much fatigued, and evidently stood in need of rest. 'If the journey you have before you is a long one,' he said, 'and don't press you for one day, you're very welcome to pass another night here. I should really be glad if you would, friend.' He saw that the old man looked at Nell, uncertain whether to accept or decline his offer, and added, 'I shall be glad to have your young companion with me for one day. If you can do a charity to a lone man, and rest yourself at the same time, do so. If you must proceed upon your journey, I wish you well through it, and will walk a little way with you before school begins.' 'What are we to do, Nell?' said the old man irresolutely. 'Say what we're to do, dear.' It required no great persuasion to induce the child to answer that they had better accept the invitation and remain. She was happy to show her gratitude to the kind schoolmaster by busying herself in the performance of such household duties as his little cottage stood in need of. When these were done, she took some needlework from her basket and sat herself down upon a stool beside the lattice, where the honeysuckle and woodbine entwined their tender stems, and stealing into the room, filled it with their delicious breath. Her grandfather was basking in the sun outside, breathing the perfume of the flowers, and idly watching the clouds as they floated on before the light summer wind. As the schoolmaster, after arranging the two forms in due order, took his seat behind his desk and made other preparations for school, the child was apprehensive that she might be in the way, and offered to withdraw to her little bedroom. But this he would not allow, and as he seemed pleased to have her there, she remained, busying herself with her work. 'Have you many scholars, sir?'
she asked. The poor schoolmaster shook his head, and said that they barely filled the two forms.
'Are the others clever, sir?'
asked the child, glancing at the trophies on the wall. 'Good boys,' returned the schoolmaster. 'Good boys enough, my dear, but they'll never do like that. A small white-headed boy with a sunburnt face appeared at the door while he was speaking, and stopping there to make a rustic bow, came in and took his seat upon one of the forms. The white-headed boy then put an open book, astonishingly dog's-eared, upon his knees, and thrusting his hands into his pockets, began counting the marbles with which they were filled, displaying in the expression of his face a remarkable capacity of totally abstracting his mind from the spelling on which his eyes were fixed. Soon afterwards another white-headed little boy came straggling in, and after him a red-headed lad, and after him two more with white heads, and then one with a flaxen poll, and so on until the forms were occupied by a dozen boys or thereabouts, with heads of every colour but grey, and ranging in their ages from 4 years old to 14 years or more. For the legs of the youngest were a long way from the floor when he sat upon the form, and the eldest was a heavy, good-tempered, foolish fellow, about half a head taller than the schoolmaster. At the top of the first form, the post of honour in the school, was the vacant place of the little sick scholar, and at the head of the row of pegs, on which those who came in hats or caps were wont to hang them up, one was left empty. No boy attempted to violate the sanctity of seat or peg, but many one looked from the empty spaces to the schoolmaster, and whispered his idle neighbour behind his hand. Then began the hum of conning over lessons, and getting them by heart, the whispered jest and stealthy game, and all the noise and drawl of school. And in the midst of the din sat the poor schoolmaster, the very image of meekness and simplicity, vainly attempting to fix his mind upon the duties of the day and to forget his little friend. But the tedium of his office reminded him more strongly of the willing scholar, and his thoughts were rambling from his pupils, it was plain. None knew this better than the idlest boys, who, growing bolder with impunity, waxed louder and more daring, playing odd or even under the master's eye, eating apples openly and without rebuke, pinching each other in sport or malice without the least reserve, and cutting their autographs in the very legs of his desk. The puzzled dunce, who stood beside it to say his lesson out of book, looked no longer at the ceiling for forgotten words, but drew closer to the master's elbow and boldly cast his eye upon the page. The wag of the little troop squinted and made grimaces at the smallest boy, of course, holding no book before his face, and his approving audience knew no constraint in their delight. If the master did chance to rouse himself and seem alive to what was going on, the noise subsided for a moment, and no eyes met his but wore a studious and deeply humble look. But the instant he relapsed again, it broke out afresh, and 10 times louder than before. Oh, how some of those idle fellows longed to be outside, and how they looked at the open door and windows as if they half meditated rushing violently out, plunging into the woods, and being wild boys and savages from that time forth! What rebellious thoughts of the cool river and some shady bathing place beneath the willow trees, with branches dipping in the water, kept tempting and urging that sturdy boy, who, with his shirt-collar unbuttoned and flung back as far as it could go, sat fanning his flushed face with the spelling-book, wishing himself a whale, or a tittleback, or a fly, or anything but a boy at school on that hot, broiling day. Heat! Ask that other boy, whose seat being nearest to the door gave him opportunities of gliding out into the garden and driving his companions to madness by dipping his face into the bucket of the well and then rolling on the grass. Ask him if there were ever such a day as that, when even the bees were diving deep down into the cups of flowers and stopping there, as if they had made up their minds to retire from business and be manufacturers of honey no more. The day was made for laziness, and lying on one's back in green places, and staring at the sky till its brightness forced one to shut one's eyes and go to sleep. And was this a time to be poring over musty books in a dark room, slighted by the very sun itself? Monstrous! Nell sat by the window occupied with her work, but attentive still to all that passed, though sometimes rather timid of the boisterous boys. The lessons over, writing time began, and there being but one desk, and that the master's, each boy sat at it in turn and laboured at his crooked copy, while the master walked about. This was a quieter time, for he would come and look over the writer's shoulder and tell him mildly to observe how such a letter was turned in such a copy on the wall, praise such an upstroke here and such a downstroke there, and bid him take it for his model. Then he would stop and tell them what the sick child had said last night, and how he had longed to be among them once again. And such was the poor schoolmaster's gentle and affectionate manner, that the boys seemed quite remorseful that they had worried him so much, and were absolutely quiet, eating no apples, cutting no names, inflicting no pinches, and making no grimaces, for full 2 minutes afterwards. 'I think, boys,' said the schoolmaster when the clock struck 12, 'that I shall give an extra half-holiday this afternoon.' At this intelligence, the boys, led on and headed by the tall boy, raised a great shout, in the midst of which the master was seen to speak, but could not be heard. As he held up his hand, however, in token of his wish that they should be silent, they were considerate enough to leave off, as soon as the longest-winded among them were quite out of breath. 'You must promise me first,' said the schoolmaster, 'that you'll not be noisy, or at least, if you are, that you'll go away, and be so away out of the village, I mean. I'm sure you wouldn't disturb your old playmate and companion.' There was a general murmur, and perhaps a very sincere one, for they were but boys, in the negative, and the tall boy, perhaps as sincerely as any of them, called those about him to witness that he had only shouted in a whisper. 'Then pray don't forget, there's my dear scholars,' said the schoolmaster, 'what I have asked you, and do it as a favour to me. Be as happy as you can, and don't be unmindful that you are blessed with health. Good-bye, all.' 'Thank'ee, sir,' and 'Good-bye, sir,' were said a good many times in a variety of voices, and the boys went out very slowly and softly. But there was the sun shining, and there were the birds singing, as the sun only shines and the birds only sing on holidays and half-holidays. There were the trees waving to all free boys to climb and nestle among their leafy branches, the hay entreating them to come and scatter it to the pure air, the green corn gently beckoning towards wood and stream, the smooth ground rendered smoother still by blending lights and shadows, inviting to runs and leaps and long walks God knows whither. It was more than boy could bear, and with a joyous whoop the whole cluster took to their heels and spread themselves about, shouting and laughing as they went. 'It's natural, thank Heaven,' said the poor schoolmaster, looking after them. 'I'm very glad they didn't mind me.' It is difficult, however, to please everybody, as most of us would have discovered, even without the fable which bears that moral. And in the course of the afternoon several mothers and aunts of pupils looked in to express their entire disapproval of the schoolmaster's proceeding. A few confined themselves to hints, such as politely inquiring what red-letter day or Saint's Day the almanac said it was. A few, these were the profound village politicians, argued that it was a slight to the throne and an affront to church and state, and savoured of revolutionary principles to grant a half-holiday upon any lighter occasion than the birthday of the monarch. But the majority expressed their displeasure on private grounds and in plain terms, arguing that to put the pupils on this short allowance of learning was nothing but an act of downright robbery and fraud, and one old lady, finding that she could not inflame or irritate the peaceable schoolmaster by talking to him, bounced out of his house, and talked at him for half an hour outside his own window to another old lady, saying that of course he would deduct this half-holiday from his weekly charge, or of course he would naturally expect to have an opposition started against him. There was no want of idle chaps in that neighbourhood, here the old lady raised her voice, and some chaps who were too idle even to be schoolmasters might soon find that there were other chaps put over their heads, and so she would have them take care and look pretty sharp about them. But all these taunts and vexations failed to elicit one word from the meek schoolmaster, who sat with the child by his side, a little more dejected perhaps, but quite silent and uncomplaining. Towards night an old woman came tottering up the garden as speedily as she could, and meeting the schoolmaster at the door, said he was to go to Dame West's directly, and had best run on before her. He and the child were on the point of going out together for a walk, and without relinquishing her hand, the schoolmaster hurried away, leaving the messenger to follow as she might. They stopped at a cottage door, and the schoolmaster knocked softly at it with his hand. It was opened without loss of time. They entered a room where a little group of women were gathered about one, older than the rest, who was crying very bitterly, and sat wringing her hands and rocking herself to and fro. "Oh, dame," said the schoolmaster, drawing near her chair, "is it so bad as this?"
"He's going fast," cried the old woman. "My grandson's dying. It's all along of you. You shouldn't see him now, but for his being so earnest on it. This is what his learning has brought him to. Oh dear, 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 what can I do?"
"Do not say that I am in any fault," urged the gentle schoolmaster. "I am not hurt, dame. No, no. You are in great distress of mind, and don't mean what you say. I am sure you don't."
"I do,"
returned the old woman.
"I mean it all. If he hadn't been poring over his books out of fear of you, he would have been well and merry now. I know he would." The schoolmaster looked round upon the other women, as if to entreat some one among them to say a kind word for him. But they shook their heads, and murmured to each other that they never thought there was much good in learning, and that this convinced them. Without saying a word in reply, or giving them a look of reproach, he followed the old woman who had summoned him, and who had now rejoined them, into another room, where his infant friend, half dressed, lay stretched upon a bed. He was a very young boy, quite a little child. His hair still hung in curls about his face, and his eyes were very bright, but their light was of heaven, not earth. The schoolmaster took a seat beside him, and stooping over the pillow, whispered his name. The boy sprung up, stroked his face with his hand, and threw his wasted arms round his neck, crying out that he was his dear kind friend.
"I hope I always was. I meant to be, God knows," said the poor schoolmaster.
"Who is that?"
said the boy, seeing Nell.
"I am afraid to kiss her, lest I should make her ill. Ask her to shake hands with me."
The sobbing child came closer up, and took the little languid hand in hers. Releasing his again after a time, the sick boy laid him gently down.
"You remember the garden, Harry?" whispered the schoolmaster, anxious to rouse him, for a dullness seemed gathering upon the child. "And how pleasant it used to be in the evening time. You must make haste to visit it again, for I think the very flowers have missed you and are less gay than they used to be. You will come soon, my dear, very soon now, won't you?"
The boy smiled faintly, so very, very faintly, and put his hand upon his friend's grey head. He moved his lips too, but no voice came from them. No, not a sound. In the silence that ensued, the hum of distant voices borne upon the evening air came floating through the open window.
"What's that?"
said the sick child, opening his eyes.
"The boys at play upon the green."
He took a handkerchief from his pillow, and tried to wave it above his head, but the feeble arm dropped powerless down.
"Shall I do it?" said the schoolmaster.
"Please, wave it at the window,"
was the faint reply.
"Tie it to the lattice. Some of them may see it there. Perhaps they'll think of me, and look this way."
He raised his head, and glanced from the fluttering signal to his idle bat, that lay with slate and book and other boyish property upon a table in the room. And then he laid him softly down once more, and asked if the little girl were there, for he could not see her. She stepped forward, and pressed the passive hand that lay upon the coverlet. The two old friends and companions, for such they were, though they were man and child, held each other in a long embrace, and then the little scholar turned his face towards the wall, and fell asleep. The poor schoolmaster sat in the same place, holding the small cold hand in his, and chafing it. It was but the hand of a dead child. He felt that, and yet he chafed it still, and could not lay it down. End of chapter 25. Of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 26. Almost broken-hearted, Nell withdrew with the schoolmaster from the bedside and returned to his cottage. In the midst of her grief and tears, she was yet careful to conceal their real cause from the old man, for the dead boy had been a grandchild, and left but one aged relative to mourn his premature decay. She stole away to bed as quickly as she could, and when she was alone gave free vent to the sorrow with which her breast was overcharged. But the sad scene she had witnessed was not without its lesson of content and gratitude, of content with the lot which left her health and freedom, and gratitude that she was spared to the one relative and friend she loved, and to live and move in a beautiful world when so many young creatures, as young and full of hope as she, were stricken down and gathered to their graves. How many of the mounds in that old churchyard where she had lately strayed grew green above the graves of children! And though she thought as a child herself, and did not perhaps sufficiently consider to what a bright and happy existence those who die young are born, and how in death they lose the pain of seeing others die around them, bearing to the tomb some strong affection of their hearts, which makes the old die many times in one long life, still she thought wisely enough to draw a plain and easy moral from what she had seen that night, and to store it deep in her mind. Her dreams were of the little scholar, not coffined and covered up, but mingling with angels and smiling happily. The sun darting his cheerful rays into the room awoke her, and now there remained but to take leave of the poor schoolmaster and wander forth once more. By the time they were ready to depart, school had begun. In the darkened room the din of yesterday was going on again, a little sobered and softened down perhaps, but only a very little, if at all. The schoolmaster rose from his desk and walked with them to the gate. It was with a trembling and reluctant hand that the child held out to him the money which the lady had given her at the races for her flowers, faltering in her thanks as she thought how small the sum was, and blushing as she offered it. But he bade her put it up, and stooping to kiss her cheek, turned back into the house. They had not gone half a dozen paces when he was at the door again. The old man retraced his steps to shake hands, and the child did the same. "Good fortune and happiness go with you," said the poor schoolmaster. "I am quite a solitary man now. If you ever pass this way again, you'll not forget the little village school?"
"We shall never forget it, sir," rejoined Nell, "nor ever forget to be grateful to you for your kindness to us."
"I have heard such words from the lips of children very often," said the schoolmaster, shaking his head and smiling thoughtfully, "but they were soon forgotten. I had attached one young friend to me, the better friend for being young, but that's over. God bless you." They bade him farewell very many times, and turned away, walking slowly and often looking back, until they could see him no more. At length they had left the village far behind, and even lost sight of the smoke among the trees. They trudged onward now at a quicker pace, resolving to keep the main road and go wherever it might lead them.
But main roads stretch a long, long way. With the exception of 2 or 3 inconsiderable clusters of cottages which they passed, without stopping, and one lonely roadside public house where they had some bread and cheese, this highway had led them to nothing. Late in the afternoon, and still lengthened out far in the distance, the same dull, tedious, winding course that they had been pursuing all day. As they had no resource, however, but to go forward, they still kept on, though at a much slower pace, being very weary and fatigued. The afternoon had worn away into a beautiful evening, when they arrived at a point where the road made a sharp turn and struck across a common. On the border of this common, and close to the hedge which divided it from the cultivated fields, a caravan was drawn up to rest, upon which, by reason of its situation, they came so suddenly that they could not have avoided it if they would. It was not a shabby, dingy, dusty cart, but a smart little house upon wheels, with white dimity curtains festooning the windows, and window shutters of green picked out with panels of a staring red, in which happily contrasted colours the whole concern shone brilliant. Neither was it a poor caravan drawn by a single donkey or emaciated horse, for a pair of horses in pretty good condition were released from the shafts and grazing on the frowsy grass. Neither was it a gipsy caravan, for at the open door, graced with a bright brass knocker, sat a Christian lady, stout and comfortable to look upon, who wore a large bonnet trembling with bows. And that it was not an unprovided or destitute caravan was clear from this lady's occupation, which was the very pleasant and refreshing one of taking tea. The tea things, including a bottle of rather suspicious character, and a cold knuckle of ham, were set forth upon a drum, covered with a white napkin, and there, as if at the most convenient round table in all the world, sat this roving lady, taking her tea and enjoying the prospect. It happened that at that moment the lady of the caravan had her cup, which, that everything about her might be of a stout and comfortable kind, was a breakfast cup, to her lips, and that having her eyes lifted to the sky in her enjoyment of the full flavour of the tea, not unmingled possibly with just the slightest dash or gleam of something out of the suspicious bottle. But this is mere speculation, and not distinct matter of history. It happened that being thus agreeably engaged, she did not see the travellers when they first came up. It was not until she was in the act of getting down the cup, and drawing a long breath after the exertion of causing its contents to disappear, that the lady of the caravan beheld an old man and a young child walking slowly by, and glancing at her proceedings with eyes of modest but hungry admiration. "Hey!" cried the lady of the caravan, scooping the crumbs out of her lap, and swallowing the same before wiping her lips. "Yes, to be sure. Who won the helter-skelter plate, child?"
"One what, ma'am?"
asked Nell.
"The helter-skelter plate at the races, child. The plate that was run for on the second day."
"On the second day, ma'am?"
"Second day. Yes, second day," repeated the lady with an air of impatience. "Can't you say who won the helter-skelter plate when you're asked the question civilly?"
"I don't know, ma'am."
"Don't know?" repeated the lady of the caravan. "Why, you were there. I saw you with my own eyes."
Nell was not a little alarmed to hear this, supposing that the lady might be intimately acquainted with the firm of Short and Codlin, but what followed tended to reassure her.
"And very sorry I was," said the lady of the caravan, "to see you in company with a Punch, a low, practical, vulgar wretch that people should scorn to look at."
"I was not there by choice," returned the child. "We didn't know our way, and the 2 men were very kind to us, and let us travel with them. Do you know them, ma'am?"
"Know 'em, child?"
cried the lady of the caravan in a sort of shriek.
"Know 'em? But you're young and inexperienced, and that's your excuse for asking such a question. Do I look as if I knowed 'em? Does the caravan look as if it knowed 'em?"
"No, ma'am, no,"
said the child, fearing she had committed some grievous fault.
"I beg your pardon."
It was granted immediately, though the lady still appeared much ruffled and discomposed by the degrading supposition. The child then explained that they had left the races on the first day, and were travelling to the next town on that road, where they purposed to spend the night. As the countenance of the stout lady began to clear up, she ventured to inquire how far it was. The reply, which the stout lady did not come to until she had thoroughly explained that she went to the races on the first day in a gig, and as an expedition of pleasure, and that her presence there had no connection with any matters of business or profit, was that the town was 8 miles off. This discouraging information a little dashed the child, who could scarcely repress a tear as she glanced along the darkening road. Her grandfather made no complaint, but he sighed heavily as he leant upon his staff, and vainly tried to pierce the dusty distance. The lady of the caravan was in the act of gathering her tea equipage together, preparatory to clearing the table, but noting the child's anxious manner, she hesitated and stopped. The child curtsied, thanked her for her information, and giving her hand to the old man, had already got some 50 yards or so away, when the lady of the caravan called to her to return. 'Come nearer, nearer still,' said she, beckoning to her to ascend the steps. 'Are you hungry, child?'
'Not very, but we are tired, and it is a long way.'
'Well, hungry or not, you'd better have some tea,' rejoined her new acquaintance. 'I suppose you're agreeable to that, old gentleman?' The grandfather humbly pulled off his hat and thanked her. The lady of the caravan then bade him come up the steps likewise, but the drum proving an inconvenient table for two, they descended again and sat upon the grass, where she handed down to them the tea-tray, the bread and butter, the knuckle of ham, and in short everything of which she had partaken herself, except the bottle which she had already embraced an opportunity of slipping into her pocket. 'Set 'em out near the hind wheels, child. That's the best place,' said their friend, superintending the arrangements from above. 'Now, hand up the teapot for a little more hot water and a pinch of fresh tea, and then both of you eat and drink as much as you can, and don't spare anything. That's all I ask of you.' They might perhaps have carried out the lady's wish, if it had been less freely expressed, or even if it had not been expressed at all. But as this direction relieved them from any shadow of delicacy or uneasiness, they made a hearty meal, and enjoyed it to the utmost. While they were thus engaged, the lady of the caravan alighted on the earth, and with her hands clasped behind her, and her large bonnet trembling excessively, walked up and down in a measured tread and very stately manner, surveying the caravan from time to time with an air of calm delight, and deriving particular gratification from the red panels and the brass knocker. When she had taken this gentle exercise for some time, she sat down upon the steps and called 'George', whereupon a man in a carter's frock, who had been so shrouded in a hedge up to this time as to see everything that passed without being seen himself, parted the twigs that concealed him, and appeared in a sitting attitude, supporting on his legs a baking dish and a half-gallon stone bottle, and bearing in his right hand a knife, and in his left a fork. 'Yes, missus,' said George. 'How did you find the cold pie, George?' 'It warn't amiss, mum.' 'And the beer?' said the lady of the caravan, with an appearance of being more interested in this question than the last. 'Is it passable, George?' 'It's more flatterer than it might be,' George returned, 'but it an't so bad for all that.' To set the mind of his mistress at rest, he took a sip, amounting in quantity to a pint or thereabouts, from the stone bottle, and then smacked his lips, winked his eye, and nodded his head. No doubt with the same amiable desire, he immediately resumed his knife and fork, as a practical assurance that the beer had wrought no bad effect upon his appetite. The lady of the caravan looked on approvingly for some time, and then said, 'Have you nearly finished?' 'Wery nigh, mum.' And indeed, after scraping the dish all round with his knife, and carrying the choice brown morsels to his mouth, and after taking such a scientific pull at the stone bottle that, by degrees almost imperceptible to the sight, his head went further and further back, until he lay nearly at his full length upon the ground, this gentleman declared himself quite disengaged, and came forth from his retreat. 'I hope I haven't hurried you, George,' said his mistress, who appeared to have a great sympathy with his late pursuit. 'If you have,' returned the follower, wisely reserving himself for any favourable contingency that might occur, 'we must make up for it next time, that's all.'
'We are not a heavy load, George?'
'That's always what the ladies say,' replied the man, looking a long way round, as if he were appealing to nature in general against such monstrous propositions. 'If you see a woman a driving, you'll always perceive that she never will keep her whip still. The horse can't go fast enough for her. If cattle have got their proper load, you never can persuade a woman that they'll not bear something more. What is the cause of this here?'
'Would these two travellers make much difference to the horses if we took them with us?' asked his mistress, offering no reply to the philosophical inquiry, and pointing to Nell and the old man, who were painfully preparing to resume their journey on foot.
'They'd make a difference in course,' said George doggedly.
'Would they make much difference?' repeated his mistress. 'They can't be very heavy.'
'The weight of the pair, mum,'
said George, eyeing them with the look of a man who was calculating within half an ounce or so,
'would be a trifle under that of Oliver Cromwell.'
Nell was very much surprised that the man should be so accurately acquainted with the weight of one whom she had read of in books as having lived considerably before their time, but speedily forgot the subject in the joy of hearing that they were to go forward in the caravan, for which she thanked its lady with unaffected earnestness. She helped with great readiness and alacrity to put away the tea things and other matters that were lying about, and, the horses being by that time harnessed, mounted into the vehicle, followed by her delighted grandfather. Their patroness then shut the door and sat herself down by her drum at an open window, and, the steps being struck by George and stowed under the carriage, away they went, with a great noise of flapping and creaking and straining, and the bright brass knocker, which nobody ever knocked at, knocking one perpetual double knock of its own accord, as they jolted heavily along. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 27. When they had travelled slowly forward for some short distance, Nell ventured to steal a look round the caravan and observe it more closely. One half of it, that moiety in which the comfortable proprietress was then seated, was carpeted, and so partitioned off at the farther end as to accommodate a sleeping place, constructed after the fashion of a berth on board ship, which was shaded, like the little windows, with fair white curtains, and looked comfortable enough, though by what kind of gymnastic exercise the lady of the caravan ever contrived to get into it was an unfathomable mystery. The other half served for a kitchen, and was fitted up with a stove whose small chimney passed through the roof. It held also a closet or larder, several chests, a great pitcher of water, and a few cooking utensils and articles of crockery. These latter necessaries hung upon the walls, which, in that portion of the establishment devoted to the lady of the caravan, were ornamented with such gayer and lighter decorations as a triangle and a couple of well-thumbed tambourines. The lady of the caravan sat at one window in all the pride and poetry of the musical instruments, and little Nell and her grandfather sat at the other in all the humility of the kettle and saucepans, while the machine jogged on and shifted the darkening prospect very slowly. At first the two travellers spoke little, and only in whispers, but as they grew more familiar with the place, they ventured to converse with greater freedom, and talk about the country through which they were passing, and the different objects that presented themselves, until the old man fell asleep, which the lady of the caravan observing, invited Nell to come and sit beside her. 'Well, child,' she said, 'how do you like this way of travelling?' Nell replied that she thought it was very pleasant indeed, to which the lady assented in the case of people who had their spirits. For herself, she said she was troubled with a lowness in that respect which required a constant stimulant, though whether the aforesaid stimulant was derived from the suspicious bottle of which mention has been already made, or from other sources, she did not say. "That's the happiness of you young people," she continued. "You don't know what it is to be low in your feelings. You always have your appetites too, and what a comfort that is." Nell thought that she could sometimes dispense with her own appetite very conveniently, and thought moreover that there was nothing either in the lady's personal appearance or in her manner of taking tea to lead to the conclusion that her natural relish for meat and drink had at all failed her. She silently assented, however, as in duty bound, to what the lady had said, and waited until she should speak again. Instead of speaking, however, she sat looking at the child for a long time in silence, and then getting up, brought out from a corner a large roll of canvas about a yard in width, which she laid upon the floor and spread open with her foot until it nearly reached from one end of the caravan to the other. "There, child," she said, "read that." Nell walked down it, and read aloud, in enormous black letters, the inscription, "Jarley's Waxwork." "Read it again," said the lady complacently. "Jarley's Waxwork," repeated Nell. "That's me," said the lady. "I am Mrs. Jarley." Giving the child an encouraging look, intended to reassure her and let her know that, although she stood in the presence of the original Jarley, she must not allow herself to be utterly overwhelmed and borne down, the lady of the caravan unfolded another scroll, whereon was the inscription, 100 figures the full size of life, and then another scroll on which was written, "The only stupendous collection of real waxworks in the world," and then several smaller scrolls with such inscriptions as, "Now exhibiting within," "The genuine and only Jarley," "Jarley's unrivalled collection," "Jarley is the delight of the nobility and gentry," "The royal family are the patrons of Jarley." When she had exhibited these leviathans of public announcement to the astonished child, she brought forth specimens of the lesser fry in the shape of handbills, some of which were couched in the form of parodies on popular melodies, as, "Believe me if all Jarley's waxwork's so rare," "I saw thy show in youthful prime," "Over the water to Jarley," while, to consult all tastes, others were composed with a view to the lighter and more facetious spirits, as a parody on the favourite air of "If I had a donkey," beginning, "If I knowed a donkey what wouldn't go to see Mrs. Jarley's waxwork show, do you think I'd acknowledge him? Oh, no, no, then run to Jarley's." Besides several compositions in prose, purporting to be dialogues between the Emperor of China and an oyster, or the Archbishop of Canterbury and a dissenter on the subject of church rates, but all having the same moral, namely, that the reader must make haste to Jarley's, and that children and servants were admitted at half price. When she had brought all these testimonials of her important position in society to bear upon her young companion, Mrs. Jarley rolled them up, and having put them carefully away, sat down again and looked at the child in triumph. "Never go into the company of a filthy Punch any more," said Mrs. Jarley, "after this."
"I never saw any waxwork, ma'am," said Nell. "Is it funnier than Punch?"
"Funnier?" said Mrs. Jarley in a shrill voice. "It is not funny at all."
"Oh!" said Nell, with all possible humility.
"It isn't funny at all," repeated Mrs. Jarley. "It's calm, and what's that word again? Critical? No, classical. That's it. It's calm and classical. No low beatings and knockings about, no jokings and squeakings like your precious Punches, but always the same with a constantly unchanging air of coldness and gentility, and so like life, that if waxwork only spoke and walked about, you'd hardly know the difference. I won't go so far as to say that, as it is, I've seen waxwork quite like life, but I've certainly seen some life that was exactly like waxwork.
'Is it here, ma'am?'
asked Nell, whose curiosity was awakened by this description. 'Is what here, child?'
'The waxwork, ma'am.'
'Why, bless you, child, what are you thinking of? How could such a collection be here, where you see everything except the inside of one little cupboard and a few boxes? It's gone on in the other vans to the assembly rooms, and there it'll be exhibited the day after tomorrow. You are going to the same town, and you'll see it, I dare say. It's natural to expect that you'll see it, and I've no doubt you will. I suppose you couldn't stop away if you was to try ever so much.'
'I shall not be in the town, I think, ma'am,' said the child.
'Not there?' cried Mrs Jarley. 'Then where will you be?'
I don't quite know. I'm not certain.'
'You don't mean to say that you're travelling about the country without knowing where you're going to?' said the lady of the caravan. 'What curious people you are! What line are you in? You look to me at the races, child, as if you were quite out of your element and had got there by accident.'
'We were there quite by accident,' returned Nell, confused by this abrupt questioning. 'We are poor people, ma'am, and are only wandering about. We have nothing to do. I wish we had.'
'You amaze me more and more,' said Mrs Jarley, after remaining for some time as mute as one of her own figures. 'Why, what do you call yourselves? Not beggars?'
'Indeed, ma'am, I don't know what else we are,' returned the child.
'Lord bless me!' said the lady of the caravan. 'I never heard of such a thing. Who'd have thought it?' She remained so long silent after this exclamation, that Nell feared she felt her having been induced to bestow her protection and conversation upon one so poor to be an outrage upon her dignity that nothing could repair. This persuasion was rather confirmed than otherwise by the tone in which she at length broke silence and said, 'And yet you can read? And write too, I shouldn't wonder.'
'Yes, ma'am,'
said the child, fearful of giving new offence by the confession.
'Well, and what a thing that is!' returned Mrs Jarley. 'I can't.'
Nell said 'indeed,' in a tone which might imply either that she was reasonably surprised to find the genuine and only Jarley, who was the delight of the nobility and gentry and a peculiar pet of the royal family, destitute of these familiar arts, or that she presumed so great a lady could scarcely stand in need of such ordinary accomplishments. In whatever way Mrs Jarley received the response, it did not provoke her to further questioning, or tempt her into any more remarks at the time, for she relapsed into a thoughtful silence, and remained in that state so long that Nell withdrew to the other window and rejoined her grandfather, who was now awake. At length the lady of the caravan shook off her fit of meditation, and, summoning the driver to come under the window at which she was seated, held a long conversation with him in a low tone of voice, as if she were asking his advice on an important point, and discussing the pros and cons of some very weighty matter. This conference at length concluded, she drew in her head again, and beckoned Nell to approach.
'And the old gentleman too,' said Mrs Jarley, 'for I want to have a word with him. Do you want a good situation for your granddaughter, master? If you do, I can put her in the way of getting one. What do you say?'
'I can't leave her,' answered the old man. 'We can't separate. What would become of me without her?'
'I should have thought you were old enough to take care of yourself, if you ever will be,' retorted Mrs Jarley sharply.
'But he never will be,' said the child in an earnest whisper. 'I fear he never will be again. Pray do not speak harshly to him. We're very thankful to you,' she added aloud. 'But neither of us could part from the other if all the wealth of the world were halved between us.
Mrs Jarley was a little disconcerted by this reception of her proposal, and looked at the old man, who tenderly took Nell's hand and detained it in his own, as if she could have very well dispensed with his company or even his earthly existence. After an awkward pause, she thrust her head out of the window again, and had another conference with the driver upon some point on which they did not seem to agree quite so readily as on the former topic of discussion. But they concluded at last, and she addressed the grandfather again. 'If you're really disposed to employ yourself,' said Mrs Jarley, 'there would be plenty for you to do in the way of helping to dust the figures and take the cheques and so forth. What I want your granddaughter for is to point him out to the company. They would be soon learnt, and she has a way with her that people wouldn't think unpleasant, though she does come after me, for I have been always accustomed to go round with visitors myself, which I should keep on doing now, only that my spirits make a little ease absolutely necessary. It's not a common offer, bear in mind,' said the lady, rising into the tone and manner in which she was accustomed to address her audiences. 'It's Jarley's waxwork, remember. The duty's very light and genteel, the company particularly select, the exhibition takes place in assembly rooms, town halls, large rooms at inns, or auction galleries. There is none of your open-air vagrancy at Jarley's, recollect. There is no tarpaulin and sawdust at Jarley's, remember. Every expectation held out in the handbills is realized to the utmost, and the whole forms an effect of imposing brilliancy hitherto unrivalled in this kingdom. Remember that the price of admission is only sixpence, and that this is an opportunity which may never occur again.' Descending from the sublime, when she had reached this point, to the details of common life, Mrs Jarley remarked that with reference to salary she could pledge herself to no specific sum until she had sufficiently tested Nell's abilities, and narrowly watched her in the performance of her duties. But board and lodging, both for her and her grandfather, she bound herself to provide, and she furthermore passed her word that the board should always be good in quality and in quantity plentiful. Nell and her grandfather consulted together, and while they were so engaged, Mrs Jarley, with her hands behind her, walked up and down the caravan, as she had walked after tea on the dull earth, with uncommon dignity and self-esteem. Nor will this appear so slight a circumstance as to be unworthy of mention, when it is remembered that the caravan was in uneasy motion all the time, and that none but a person of great natural stateliness and acquired grace could have forborne to stagger. 'Now, child,' cried Mrs Jarley, coming to a halt as Nell turned towards her.
'We are very much obliged to you, ma'am,' said Nell, 'and thankfully accept your offer.'
'And you'll never be sorry for it,' returned Mrs Jarley. 'I'm pretty sure of that. So, as that's all settled, let us have a bit of supper.'
In the meanwhile, the caravan blundered on as if it too had been drinking strong beer and was drowsy, and came at last upon the paved streets of a town, which were clear of passengers and quiet, for it was by this time near midnight, and the townspeople were all abed. As it was too late an hour to repair to the exhibition room, they turned aside into a piece of waste ground that lay just within the old town gate, and drew up there for the night near to another caravan which, notwithstanding that it bore on the lawful panel the great name of Jarley, and was employed besides in conveying from place to place the waxwork which was its country's pride, was designated by a grovelling stamp office as a common stage waggon, and numbered to 7,000 odd hundred, as though its precious freight were mere flour or coals. This ill-used machine being empty, for it had deposited its burden at the place of exhibition, and lingered here until its services were again required, was assigned to the old man as his sleeping place for the night, and within its wooden walls Nell made him up the best bed she could from the materials at hand. For herself, she was to sleep in Mrs Jarley's own travelling carriage, as a signal mark of that lady's favour and confidence. She had taken leave of her grandfather, and was returning to the other waggon, when she was tempted by the coolness of the night to linger for a little while in the air. The moon was shining down upon the old gateway of the town, leaving the low archway very black and dark, and with a mingled sensation of curiosity and fear, she slowly approached the gate, and stood still to look up at it, wondering to see how dark and grim and old and cold it looked. There was an empty niche from which some old statue had fallen or been carried away hundreds of years ago, and she was thinking what strange people it must have looked down upon when it stood there, and how many hard struggles might have taken place, and how many murders might have been done upon that silent spot, when there suddenly emerged from the black shade of the arch a man. The instant he appeared, she recognized him. Who could have failed to recognize in that instant the ugly, misshapen Quilp? The street beyond was so narrow, and the shadow of the houses on one side of the way so deep, that he seemed to have risen out of the earth. But there he was. The child withdrew into a dark corner, and saw him pass close to her. He had a stick in his hand, and, when he had got clear of the shadow of the gateway, he leant upon it, looked back, directly as it seemed, towards where she stood, and beckoned. To her? Oh no, thank God, not to her. For as she stood in an extremity of fear, hesitating whether to scream for help or come from her hiding-place and fly before he should draw nearer, there issued slowly forth from the arch another figure, that of a boy, who carried on his back a trunk. "Faster, sirrah!" cried Quilp, looking up at the old gateway, and showing in the moonlight like some monstrous image that had come down from its niche and was casting a backward glance at its old house. "Faster!" "It's a dreadful heavy load, sir," the boy pleaded. "I've come on very fast, considering." "You have come fast, considering?" retorted Quilp. "You creep, you dog, you crawl, you measure distance like a worm. There are the chimes now, 12:30. He stopped to listen, and then turning upon the boy with a suddenness and ferocity that made him start, asked at what hour that London coach passed the corner of the road. The boy replied, at 1. "Come on, then," said Quilp, "or I shall be too late. Faster, do you hear me? Faster!" The boy made all the speed he could, and Quilp led onward, constantly turning back to threaten him and urge him to greater haste. Nell did not dare to move until they were out of sight and hearing, and then hurried to where she had left her grandfather, feeling as if the very passing of the dwarf so near him must have filled him with alarm and terror. But he was sleeping soundly, and she softly withdrew. As she was making her way to her own bed, she determined to say nothing of this adventure, as upon whatever errand the dwarf had come, and she feared it must have been in search of them, it was clear by his inquiry about the London coach that he was on his way homeward, and as he had passed through that place, it was but reasonable to suppose that they were safer from his inquiries there than they could be elsewhere. These reflections did not remove her own alarm, for she had been too much terrified to be easily composed, and felt as if she were hemmed in by a legion of Quilps, and the very air itself were filled with them. The delight of the nobility and gentry, and the patronized of royalty, had, by some process of self-abridgment known only to herself, got into her travelling bed, where she was snoring peacefully, while the large bonnet, carefully disposed upon the drum, was revealing its glories by the light of a dim lamp that swung from the roof. The child's bed was already made upon the floor, and it was a great comfort to her to hear the steps removed as soon as she had entered, and to know that all easy communication between persons outside and the brass knocker was by this means effectually prevented. Certain guttural sounds, too, which from time to time ascended through the floor of the caravan, and a rustling of straw in the same direction, apprised her that the driver was couched upon the ground beneath, and gave her an additional feeling of security. Notwithstanding these protections, she could get none but broken sleep by fits and starts all night, for fear of Quilp, who throughout her uneasy dreams was somehow connected with the waxwork, or was waxwork himself, or was Mrs. Jarley and waxwork too, or was himself Mrs. Jarley, waxwork, and a barrel organ all in one, and yet not exactly any of them either. At length, towards break of day, that deep sleep came upon her which succeeds to weariness and over-watching, and which has no consciousness but one of overpowering and irresistible enjoyment. End of chapter 27.